Well, you're all very welcome. My name is Colin Barr. I'm professor of modern Irish history and director of the Klingon Family Centre for the Study of Modern Ireland at the University of Notre Dame. And I begin by apologizing for looking like I slept in my clothes, because I in fact did, having arrived this morning at 4:45 a.m., 2 days late here in Dublin and without my suitcase. So my remarks will be necessarily brief for fear of not being able to form complete sentences, but thankfully my task is very easy. First, it is to welcome you to this joint event with UCD, and my colleague Niamh will speak in a moment. But first, also, most importantly, I think to thank the Notre Dame and UCD staff who have made all of this possible. Pauline, who many of you know at the back, Pádraig Dempsey, Becky Artinian-Kaiser. This is an event that's been many, many months in preparation, a year more in preparation, I think. And it's splendid to see all of you here today, and I think it's going to be a tremendous event. This is exactly what the Klingon Family Centre is meant to do at Notre Dame. Our task is to bring, as our publicity material has it, to bring Ireland to Notre Dame and Notre Dame to Ireland, but also Ireland to the world and the world to Ireland. We're focused primarily on policy and modern Ireland, contemporary Ireland, and this is right in our wheelhouse. So it's a great pleasure to see you all here, and to hand you over to Niamh Moore-Cherry, from UCD, who is our co-sponsor today.
Brilliant, thanks. Thank you very much, Colin. On behalf of all my colleagues at UCD, I want to say a very warm welcome from the College of Social Sciences and Law, and also from UCD more generally, Ireland's global university. I had to get that in. So on behalf of us all, it really is a pleasure to be here in the home of UCD, hosting this event today. And our college, the College of Social Sciences and Law, is a place where debate and dialogue and engagement, such as that you're going to have to do, you're doing today, is really at the centre of what we do. And through our undergraduate and graduate education, research, and our external engagement, we really want to make sure that our students, our faculty, and our staff have the opportunity to contribute to debates such as this that contribute to sustainable well-being right across the world, as well as in Ireland and on our campus. So within that sort of broad framework, I'm really delighted to see this collaboration between the University of Notre Dame, the School of Politics and International Relations, and the Department of Foreign Affairs. And I suppose that represents the interdisciplinarity, collegiality, and our desire to really make a difference in the world. That really is at the heart of what we do in our particular college. This is a really important time in global politics and geopolitics, and as somebody who was an undergraduate joint major in geography and politics, I'm actually really fascinated and very sad that I can't stay for the whole day today. But what I do want to say is this is a really important time. So dialogue, debate, constructive engagement with people of similar and diverse views is really so important in progressing the agendas where we can protect all, where we can look at trade, the future of trade, the various different challenges we face as a global society. So things like AI, climate action are not things we can do in a vacuum. They're things that we need to work together globally to do. So I'm really delighted to see so many people from a variety of institutions, organizations here today. I'm very excited to hear what the outputs of the day are going to be, and I wish you all well and hope that you have a productive and constructive engagement. And thank you to our colleagues at the University of Notre Dame, including Pauline, for doing a lot of the running today, and our colleague Alex Tukalski at University College Dublin, who has been instrumental in working with Colin and colleagues in putting the event together today. So thank you and good luck.
Thank you very much. As Niamh mentioned, my name is Alex Tukalski. I am Associate Professor in the School of Politics and International Relations here at, at UCD. I also direct the UCD Center for Asia-Pacific Research, which is an academic-led interdisciplinary research hub for academics in the social sciences and humanities with an interest in the Asia-Pacific. First, I would also like to thank a number of people who have made this event possible. First is the University of Notre Dame, the Keough School of International Affairs, and the Klingon Family Centre for the Study of Modern Ireland, represented by Colin, and Pauline McNamara. Where's Pauline? Is she here? Pauline. Thank you, Pauline, she has organized everything behind the scenes and has been incredible. And from Notre Dame, my academic partner in crime, Josh Eisenman, you will hear from later, who also just arrived at 4:45 this morning, so welcome. 5:50 now. So I also want to thank the Department of Foreign Affairs for productive conversations and collaboration on this event, particularly the Asia-Pacific unit. And some people who contributed financially to the event: the Political Studies Association of Ireland, which is our professional network of political scientists and international relations scholars in Ireland, helped fund this event, so thank you to the PSAI. And finally, within UCD, the College of Social Sciences and Law, represented by Niamh Moore-Cherry, my dean, my boss's boss, essentially. Very much thank you for funding the event, the School of Politics and International Relations, and the UCD President's Office. There, everybody is thanked. Everybody worked extremely hard and did an amazing job to bring you all here today. Now, I've been asked to say a few words about Ireland, China, and the global political landscape. As Colin mentioned, we've been planning this event for a long period of time. It maybe feels even longer than it actually has been, but it's been more than a year that we've been planning this event. But the utility of the event became clear to me in January of this year. Because in January of this year, Chinese Premier Li Qiang visited Dublin after the World Economic Forum. It was his only stop in Europe other than Switzerland, and it was mostly, as you may recall, a charm-offensive kind of visit. There was an announcement of visa-free travel for some Irish citizens, a resumption of beef exports. But I was struck by the question that so many journalists and observers and ordinary people were asking, which is, why Ireland? Why is he visiting Ireland out of all the possible European destinations that he could have visited? It's not a straightforward question, but I think the fact that people were asking it really underscored for me the utility of an event like this, where we can come together and talk about Ireland-China relations. Why Ireland is not a straightforward question, but let me put a few thoughts out there. I think there are a few factors relevant, and we're going to unpack all of these throughout the day. Okay? First is that China sees Ireland, I believe, as a potentially friendly voice in the European Union. Many observers have noted that Ireland has recently run a trade surplus with China, although, as we'll unpack, the numbers maybe are a little bit questionable or not so straightforward on that. But the basic idea is that Ireland has an interest in continued trade. Irish officials have occasionally previously presented Ireland as a gateway to Europe. And so there's very much an interest in the Chinese side, from the Chinese side in Ireland. China sometimes makes, Chinese officials sometimes make ideological appeals to Ireland's history of resisting foreign domination and the like, positioning the two states as like-minded in some respects. It's not clear how successful these appeals are, but they are made, I think it's fair to say. A second factor, I think, is that Ireland is not a member of NATO and is, of course, militarily neutral. Chinese officials are highly critical of NATO, and this may have been part of the calculus for why Ireland. All this is to say that beyond the announcement of visa-free travel and beef exports and the very large airplane landing at Dublin Airport that people paid a lot of attention to, there are deeper undercurrents in global politics that shape a visit like this, and I hope that we can unpack them throughout the course of today. Let me note a few of those undercurrents. One is that China and Russia are growing closer together. Yesterday, this week I should say, issuing another appeal on, another statement, a joint statement on cooperation. While it's very clear there are limitations and potential fissures in that relationship, it's also very clear that these two powers are growing closer together, not just for convenience, I would argue, but also in part because of ideological conviction. The second factor is China's domestic political system. China is rising and becoming more important in the world as an authoritarian power. To understand China's foreign policy requires an understanding of the domestic drivers and brakes on its foreign policy. What is clear is that China's system of single-party rule is now a global issue in ways that it perhaps was not 10 or 15 years ago, or in ways that we didn't fully understand 10 or 15 years ago. Okay? Domestically, there has been a renewed clampdown on liberal ideas about politics and human rights, and this shapes, to some degree, China's foreign policy. The third factor I would note is the changing role of the United States in the world. Some of this is structural. The US is less powerful now, relatively, than it was in the past. Some of it is domestic. I know there are differing views in this room on how this is playing out, but it's clear that there are deep disagreements domestically in the United States about the US's role in the world, particularly when it comes to engagement with promoting political values. And finally, Europe's changing approach to China. In the 1990s and early 2000s, to oversimplify, I think China was viewed as an economy. Okay? And in the past 15 years, and especially the last 10 years, it's increasingly viewed as having politics of its own and political ambitions that potentially impact on Europe. Hence, conversations in Europe using terms like de-risking and the like, and debates that are around those sorts of terms. All of this is taking place amongst interconnectedness and linkages that are really complicated, that are broad, and that are deep. Okay. I could go on, and I'm sure we'll unpack many of these issues throughout the day, but Ireland specifically has major challenges to navigate its relations with China amidst these developments. Ireland wishes to maintain an open economic system with a foreign policy that, on its own terms, values human rights. When it comes to China, this is a deep challenge, and one that I think we will discuss throughout the day. Furthermore, in my view, Ireland is facing these challenges with a knowledge gap when it comes to China. This is not unique to Ireland, but popular knowledge about Chinese domestic politics and foreign policy is relatively low. I think about my Irish friends and neighbors who followed the US election and saw the zoom-in map on CNN and the swing counties and were able to name like district attorneys in Atlanta and so on. And I would challenge that probably most people couldn't name 2, 3 Chinese politicians, right? Again, this is not unique to Ireland, but I do think that we here haven't yet compensated for this by building a robust, independent knowledge infrastructure when it comes to politics and foreign policy. And to my mind, this is an urgent task. As a step in that direction, for this event, we brought together a variety of experts from around the world to focus on these issues, and I hope you'll enjoy it as much as I know I will, for sure. 3 points of housekeeping, let me note. One is this event is on the record. We're going to be recording it for posterity to write a report. So in order to write that report accurately, we have to record it. So when you have questions or comments, it's on the record, and you need to assume it's public. Okay? Second is that our speakers come from a variety of institutions and have a variety of viewpoints, and I'd like to underscore that their views are their own and don't represent the views of their institutions or employers or anything like that, right? I see some smiles in the audience. It's their own views that they will be presenting. Finally, we may address some controversies or have some disagreements today, as Professor Morcheri noted, and that's okay. Look, we can approach today by addressing controversial points in a straightforward but respectful and substantive way, and we'll all be fine, and it'll be wonderful at the end of the day. So with that, again, I'm very excited for this event, and I'm really looking forward to the discussions today, and I'll leave it there and hand it over to my colleague, Joshua Eisenman from the University of Notre Dame.
Thanks, Alex. You probably want to give me the microphone. Thank you. All right. I guess this is a good time, if you're standing by the door, to come on in and grab a seat. Yeah. Well, it's great to see a room full of full room here. After so many months of planning, it's always good when something comes off and you get to look at the faces of the people who've come. And I want to thank specifically the panelists who've come so far to be here today. And many thank yous have been given, so I want to reiterate all those thank yous. But, oh yeah. I am a double mic'd. Okay. Sorry, no wonder I was getting feedback. So I wanted to, before we turn to our keynote speaker, my friend Demetri Sevastopulo, I want to just think back a little bit about where we've come from in terms of US-China relations. And, you know, Demetri and I were just talking, and I think we first met in 03, 04, right? So nearly 20 years ago, right around the time that China had just been admitted to the WTO. And so I was thinking about the kind of views that were being expressed about China at the time. And I wanted to kind of lay those out quickly and then talk about what is now the current view of China. So in the United States in the 2000s, about the time Demetri and I met, I would say the mainstream view was essentially liberalization through engagement. It was a modernization theory that we are going to, through economic engagement, through neoliberal engagement, through academic institutions like ours, we would engage China and make China a more liberal place, right? A kind of constructivist view. At the very least, even if China didn't liberalize, it would become a more friendly place to the West and to the United States in general. And this was the mainstream view expressed regularly in Washington at the time. The second view that you would hear sometimes was, don't worry about the Communist Party of China, it's going to collapse because that's what Communist Party of China, that's what Communist parties do. So you don't have to worry about it because eventually it's just going to run its course and collapse. And then the third view, which I held at the time and others did too, I call the rickety house. And this was that Chinese system had a lot of different elements of power in it. And these elements of power would balance off of each other, creating a kind of Chinese type of pluralism. It wasn't liberal democracy, but it would kind of move in this way such that as the rickety house moved, different gusts of wind, some liberal, some illiberal, would get into the house, and therefore China would still, it would kind of muddle along as it was. None of these were correct. None of these were correct in hindsight. And perhaps the most correct view was expressed by James Mann in his book, The China Fantasy, where he said that the Chinese system would simply get harder and gradually move from authoritarianism towards totalitarianism. But even James Mann, and his more pessimistic view, did not consider that China would move to the chairman of all things, that one person would again be able to exert the kind of power over the system that Mr. Xi Jinping does today. And I think this should give us some modesty, I think, and as we look at China, to know that those people who knew the most about China were, from my perspective, the most wrong about China. So where are we today? Well, I would say the mainstream view is something I would call constrainment. And it's advocated by the Biden administration. In fact, I would say it's the least worst option. And that is, we put guardrails on the US-China relationship. We cooperate where we can, we compete where we must, we try to avoid direct conflict, we work with our allies, we build up a deterrence architecture, and we set our red lines. We bring India on board, we bring Europe on board, right? And this, I would say, is the mainstream view right now. We've evolved to the point where we no longer think that we can evolve China by engaging China. But there are others, more hardliners views that you hear in Washington. People who talk about containment or even rolling back. These folks talk about an aggressive anti-China strategy that seeks to, if possible, even bring down the Communist Party of China. We hear this often from certain elements on the right in the United States. And then the third view, which is interesting because it's been picked up by these optimists, the same people who brought us engagement, are now bringing us what I call a wait-and-see approach. Xi Jinping is bad, yeah, Xi Jinping is terrible, but hope springs eternal. The next leader may be different. China may liberalize yet and return to the path of reform, they tell us. And they claim there are two traditions in China, a reform path and a totalitarian or an authoritarian path, and China's pendulum may yet swing. And so I wanted to just take one quick second here before we turn to my friend Demetri and explain what I think is going on here. Well, first, as I said, I think the first is the least worst option that we can take at this point, a kind of hedging strategy. But the second, I believe, is very dangerous. The second strategy, this containment approach, and let me say why. The master narrative taught to every Chinese child is called the century of humiliation. And what it basically says is the West is trying to hold us down. The West is trying to keep us down. They always have and they always will. And that second approach of containing China plays directly into that narrative. In fact, it would only, in my opinion, harden the Communist Party of China's power and control over the country because it affirms the very thing they are teaching their children every day. So my view is an aggressive approach to pull down the Communist Party of China would be ill-fated and, in fact, would backfire. The third approach, however, this wait-and-see approach is equally treacherous, in my opinion, because it's an argument that essentially says the problem is one man, not the system. The problem is not the party, the problem is this one guy, and we can simply wait him out. To me, this is problematic, first, because it is exactly what the Communist Party of China would want us to do. Not take action against their illiberal, authoritarian, at least, approach. So I think that this is problematic. However, it is also based on the assumption that China is fundamentally a pro-Western place. And fundamentally, right now, I think that's not necessarily the case. As Alex said, and as many of us have seen in the newspapers, China is moving closer and closer to Russia, closer and closer to Iran. So the idea that such a pendulum would swing back, to me, is almost essentially fool's gold. And finally, I think it's just bad history. I think it's bad history because when Xi Jinping came to power, the idea was, generally speaking, that Hu Jintao, his predecessor, had been too weak and too feckless, and China needed a strong leader who would pull the country together, who would whip the Communist Party into shape and eliminate corruption. Xi Jinping is not an aberration. He's not a quirk. He is a feature of the system that China has today. And it is my supposition, and I would like to hear what Demetri says about this, that the most likely scenario is not one that we will swing back towards liberalization, but rather that we will probably end up with a Chinese version of Vladimir Putin, an now unknown apparatchik within the security state apparatus who knows how to utilize power within the system, who is linked to the security system, both in terms of the guns as well as the cameras, as well as the facial recognition, who can bring all of these together. The idea that we will shift back to a liberal China, to me, is fool's gold. And so this is, as I see, the kind of evolution over the 20 years we've known each other, Demetri. And so I'm very curious to hear your views here today. And I know we're all excited. I think your biography is in the book, so I won't go through it. But suffice it to say, you've worked for the Financial Times for over 20 years now. You've reported on China policy from the Defense Department in the United States, and now you work specifically on U.S.-China relations. And you are an Irishman, as I understand it. So we are thrilled to have you here today, and I want to invite you to the stage to provide your remarks and then to take some questions from me and then from the audience.
I have a Donald Trump-like teleprompter here to help me. First of all, good morning, everyone. Thank you to Notre Dame and UCD, and also a huge thanks to Pauline, who's been very generous in responding to all of my emails. I'm delighted to be with you here in Dublin. I grew up in Howth on the north side. And for my American friends, you may find my Dublin accent's a bit thicker now that I'm back home, but we have interpreters at the back. And judging the number of glasses of water here, you probably think I'm going to speak for an hour. But rest assured, to avoid being compared to Joe Biden, I'm going to try and be very succinct, speak for about 20 minutes, and then look forward to your questions. Speaking of which. So I'm going to start off by focusing on US-China relations and then look at the implications for Ireland, which is one of the many small countries that is navigating the choppy waters of US-China relations these days. And particularly start off by looking at the evolution of US-China policy under Joe Biden. So when Biden was elected in 2020, many US allies, particularly in Asia, I'm thinking of Japan specifically, were actually worried that Biden would be soft on China and that he wouldn't continue some of the Trump policies, which they actually liked, even if it was a little bit chaotic. But it soon became clear that he was going to be tough on China, and that he was even going to keep some of Trump's own China policies, which I think shocked a lot of people. There were some early signs of this. Tony Blinken, when he had his confirmation hearing for Secretary of State, he told members of Congress that China's activities in Xinjiang amounted to genocide, mirroring the language that the Trump administration had first used. No one else in the US government had ever said that. And then when he was asked about how Biden would approach China, he said, actually, Trump had the right idea on China. He had the right goal. We just don't like the way that he conducted his policies. They were too chaotic. Biden then had a call with Xi Jinping, although it took several weeks, which was very unusual. Normally, a US president would speak to a Chinese president much more quickly. He criticized China's coercive economic behavior and human rights record. And then virtually, he told the Munich Security Conference a few weeks later that the US and Europe needed to come together and prepare for long-term strategic competition with China amid an emerging battle between democracies and autocracies. And then many of you will probably remember the famous meeting in Alaska when Blinken and his counterpart Yang Jiechi had a fiery public exchange at the Captain Cook Hotel, or as I wrote in the Financial Times at the time, the Captain Hook Hotel, and then had to correct myself. I had even stayed there once. In Biden's first few months, Taiwan also started to heat up. Washington sent multiple warnings to Beijing about Chinese warplanes violating Taiwan's air defense identification zone. And we reported that Chinese bombers around the same time simulated missile attacks on the USS Teddy Roosevelt aircraft carrier, which was operating in the vicinity of Taiwan. So things were getting quite heated. And then Admiral Philip Davidson, who was then the head of US Indo-Pacific Command, told Congress that he thought China could attack Taiwan before 2027. which became known as the Davidson window in Washington, and then sparked a string of contradictory predictions from US admirals and generals about when China would move in on Taiwan, until about a year ago when the Pentagon told them to shut up and stop peeking about timelines. But how has Biden differed from Trump? Clearly, he's taken a strong line on Beijing, but where he's been very different is he's put much more emphasis on shoring up alliances to create counterbalances and counterweights to China in the region. Early on, he convened a leaders' summit of the Quad, which is, as many of you know, the US, Japan, Australia, and India. When then Japanese Prime Minister Suga visited the White House as the first foreign leader to meet Biden, in their joint statement, they talked about peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait, which might sound pretty innocuous. It was the first time Japan had done that since 1969. And the next day in Japanese newspapers, every newspaper, the first 3 pages was 100% about Taiwan. It was incredible. More recently, Biden's had success crafting measures both with allies and then encouraging US allies to work more with each other to counter China. One of the most notable examples is the Philippines last year agreed to give the US access to 4 more bases in the country. Japan, for decades of pacifist power, has signed reciprocal access agreements with both Australia and UK, which allows their militaries to operate and exercise and train in each other's countries, which is actually quite a big deal. And Tokyo is also negotiating one of these agreements with Manila right now. So what we're seeing, if you step back, is the US moving from what they call a hub and spoke system to a latticed security architecture, where you have a number of overlapping minilateral security agreements. And the goal is basically to send a message as you think it's just the US versus China. Well, it's not. It's the US and its allies, and sometimes its partners, all aligned against what we think are the malign activities that you're conducting in the Indo-Pacific and beyond. And I think in that context, one of the biggest changes over the past few years has been the growing US convergence with Europe on China. And I think one small but stark example, in 2021, the US, EU, Canada, and UK coordinated the imposition of sanctions on Chinese officials over the persecution of Uyghurs in Xinjiang. And I originally thought it was the US putting pressure on the Europeans, but it was actually the reverse. The Europeans came to the US and said, let's do this together. I can't think of another example in the recent past where that's happened. Biden has also corralled allies to agree at international summits, be it the G7 or the NATO summits, to rebuke China over everything from Xinjiang, crackdown on pro-democracy activists in Hong Kong, and its assertive military activity around Taiwan. And then finally, the US has also urged European allies to boost their naval presence in the South China Sea, which sometimes is controversial. People will say, well, what can the Europeans really do? Are they going to come to Taiwan's defense in the case of war? But the UK, France, and the Netherlands deployed vessels to the region, and right now Germany is actually sending 2 ships, which I think are either just arrived in Canada or on their way there, and are going to make their way out to the South China Sea. And if one or both of them does not sail through the Taiwan Strait, I'll be quite surprised. And then very recently, US Deputy Secretary of State Kurt Campbell, who was also the White House Indo-Pacific coordinator before that, he said at a conference, and I quote, that the US had done war games with the Brits to think about regional scenarios. 5 years ago, there was no way the UK would be doing war games with the US about Taiwan. So these all things might sound quite small, but when you put them all together, it's actually huge changes. And while the US has been doing this, relations with China basically hit rock bottom in 2022 and 2023, the lowest point in relations since they established ties with Beijing in 1979. In 2022, we broke the story that Nancy Pelosi was going to visit Taiwan. Everyone saw what the Chinese did. They were furious with her, furious with Biden. 6 months later, Washington reacted angrily when the Chinese spy balloon flew across North America. And in what I call one of those classic only in America moments, former US ambassador to China, Max Baucus, told me, he's a Montanan, that his neighbors, the ranchers, were basically joking with each other, competing who had the biggest gun that could shoot down the Chinese balloon. But it was actually an important point because people could see the balloon, and it made something that was very abstract, very real. China is also very exasperated about US technology export controls, which we can chat a little about later. But all of these issues were on the table when Biden and Xi held their in-person summit in San Francisco in November. And for different reasons, both leaders agreed to try and stabilize relations to avoid, in the words of Biden, competition veering into conflict. Since then, we've seen an easing of tensions in some ways. I think the most notable is for the previous 2 years, Chinese fighter jets had been engaging in risky and coercive maneuvers where they would fly very, very close to US spy planes that are flying up and down the coast of China, and making some people worried that you could have a kind of incident that you had back in 2001 when a US spy plane was hit by a Chinese fighter jet. So that's stopped for now, which is good news. And I think one of the ways that the US and China have managed to pull back from the brink a little bit, get past the Pelosi incident and Balloon Gate, is through a series of back-channel meetings that Jake Sullivan has held with Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi in Vienna, Malta, Bangkok, and not been written publicly before, but they actually considered doing one in Dublin at one point. So they've got good taste. And in addition to rebooting the high-level engagement that was halted after the balloon incident and paving the road to San Francisco, the back channel is also very important in that it sends a message to allies that Washington is trying to responsibly manage this strategic competition that it has with China. And I think the US came under more pressure to do that because again in 2022 and 2023, when I talked to officials from allied and partner countries, increasingly there was concern that the US and China were somehow edging closer to a conflict over Taiwan, that it wasn't going to be imminent, but they were heading towards a collision, and it was very important to find ways to make them pull back a little bit. So one question I frequently get is, will the easing of tensions since San Francisco last, or is it just a tactical pause in what's becoming a never-ending strategic competition? Now, I'm an optimist by nature, and when you grow up in the north side of Dublin, you have to be. But I'm not optimistic that US-China relations will actually improve in the near to medium term. I think while the waters may be calmer at the surface, the fault lines are very deep, and there is no sign of détente on the horizon. So take Taiwan, for example. We just had the inauguration of President Lai Ching-te on Monday. China views him as a dangerous separatist. They view him more skeptically than his predecessor, Tsai Ing-wen. But since his election in January until inauguration, China had actually been relatively muted in its response, partly because Lai's party didn't win a majority in the legislature. So China is able to tell itself a story that, yes, Lai, a pro-independence candidate, won the election, but in the legislature, more pro-Beijing parties did better than expected. So things are moving in our direction, which I think is a false narrative, but that's one they're definitely telling themselves. When I originally wrote my remarks, I wrote, but now that he's in office, things could heat up quickly if China gets nervous about his approach. And then I woke up this morning and saw that China is holding 2 days of very extensive military drills around pretty much the whole of Taiwan. So it's already started. And I think we're going to see more and more of this as time goes on. Partly the US is going to continue to take actions like supplying weapons to Taiwan that will infuriate Beijing. China is not going to abandon its view that Taiwan is an inalienable part of its territory. And so I think there's no solution. And the best we can hope for in the near to medium term is that Beijing, Washington, and Taipei very carefully manage relations so that we have some version of the status quo for years to come and we don't get anywhere near a conflict. At the same time, the US is going to continue to introduce export controls on technology and other measures that Jake Sullivan likes to call small yard, high fence policy. But China doesn't view it as a small yard. It thinks it's a big yard, and it's worried that the yard is going to get bigger and bigger. And in some cases, you can see why they would think that. For example, last week, they were furious when Biden imposed sharply higher tariffs on imports of Chinese electric vehicles. It accused Biden of reneging on a commitment not to push for economic decoupling. But the US has made clear in its engagements with China. I was with Secretary Yellen of the Treasury in Beijing last year, and she said, we'd like to cooperate on all these things, but that doesn't mean we're not going to take national security measures when we feel it's in our interest, or economic security measures. So the US, I don't think, is going to back off on any of that. So the question is, kind of getting to the Ireland-China relationship, what implications does this have for Ireland-China relations? But before I jump into that, I just want to tell you a short story and bring you back to 1997, just to illustrate the dramatic change that we've seen over the past quarter century. So back then I was living in Tokyo. I had two very good Chinese friends who asked me one day, where should they go and study English that summer? I suggested Dublin. I helped them write letters to get a visa, etc. They came here, had a great time, came back to Tokyo and said, we've been to your tiny little country to study English. It's time for you to go to the most important country in the world and study our language. I was working as a trader at Citibank and was miserable, so I was looking for an excuse to escape. And I found out that the Chinese government had scholarships for nationals from many countries, including Ireland, to study Chinese at Beijing University. So I applied through the Irish Department of Education and was over the moon when I got a scholarship. And if you saw my grades from Trinity College, you'd understand why I was over the moon. Then when I arrived in Beijing, after a few weeks, I went out one night with some Irish people I'd met, including an Irish diplomat, who boasted to his friends who were there that I was one of the only 2 Irish students who had won a scholarship to come to China. And I was kind of, oh, that's fantastic. But I was curious, so how many people applied? And he said, 2. And aside from puncturing my pride, the point of the story is, back then, as far as I remember, you couldn't actually study Chinese in Ireland in any university. There was Japanese in DCU and maybe some other places. And there was really no connectivity between Ireland and China. Very, very little. But now, you know, here we are having this conference today, which is fantastic, a testament to how much has changed. Alex mentioned Li Chang, who was here. That was the first visit by a Chinese premier since 2015, when Li Keqiang came. And I was going to talk about Ireland being a gateway to Europe and all of those things, but you guys have talked about that. And most of the things I've said today are borrowed heavily from many of the things that you've sent me. So I owe a great debt of gratitude to everyone. There's one issue, I think, where in the news right now, where Dublin is arguably in closer step with Beijing than Washington, and that's the situation in Gaza and Ireland's decision to recognize Palestine as a state. And while Ireland has obviously criticized the Hamas attack on October 7th, and China has not, overall, Ireland is completely at odds with the US on this. And so this is one example of where maybe it's in China's interest to come to Ireland because it sees areas where Ireland can help China on the global stage, even if it's not intentionally. Xi Jinping also came to Ireland in 2012, and many of you will remember, when he was vice president. And if I remember correctly, he spent more time in Ireland on that trip than he has spent in China as either, in the US as either vice president or president. So that's another win for the Irish. And when media run stories about Xi Jinping and his love of soccer, you'll often see the same photo of him kicking a ball, kind of a risque move for a Chinese leader, because it looks like he's about to fall over. But what many people outside of Ireland don't realise is that was in Croke Park in 2012, and he was kicking a Gaelic football, not a soccer ball. Now, if that's not soft power, I don't know what is. So the Irish government should be selling that. Continuing with the good news side of the ledger, Irish trade with China has soared. In 2022, Irish exports to China were 13 billion euro, which is a 325% rise over 5 years. And as the FT, we're obliged to include statistics like that. But hidden in that number, unless I've read the data incorrectly, is the fact exports actually fell last year, turning what had been a 3 billion euro surplus in 2021 into a 1 billion euro deficit in 2022. You know, Ireland had been the only nation to have a trade surplus with China. And so I think the question is, well, 2022 is kind of a blip, or is it the start of a reversal of the previous trend? I think that's a big question for Ireland. And the answer to that may lie on what I call the good side of the ledger, which is Irish exports to China right now are dominated by chips. And I mean semiconductors, not potatoes, for anyone who's wondering. They make up roughly 2/3 of the total of exports. And you know, that's testimony to how Ireland has successfully lured American companies like Intel here, and has also maintained pro-business relations with Beijing, which until now has worked very well. But I think it's worth asking, is Ireland too reliant on chip exports to China, particularly as the US continues with a slew of measures to restrict US technology going to China, even if it's going to China from other countries? Until recently, when we were writing about US export controls in Washington, pretty much everything was focused on high-end, cutting-edge chips, the kind of things you use for ChatGPT or other AI models. But we had a story a couple of weeks ago which didn't get a lot of attention, which is that the Commerce Department has revoked licenses for Intel and Qualcomm to sell chips to Huawei. And these are less advanced chips, and some of these chips are coming from Intel's plants in Ireland. So I suspect that's something that needs to be watched closely to see actually what kind of a longer term impact it has. And just to show you how people may have been surprised by this, when Tony Blinken was in Beijing a week or two before our story ran, he used the fact that an Intel chip was being used to power Huawei's latest laptop as evidence that the US was not trying to contain China's economic rise. He comes back to Washington, and a week later, the Commerce Department has revoked those licenses. So you can see why China sometimes says, hold on a second, the rhetoric doesn't match the reality. Another risk for Ireland is that, and I think I owe this to a paper that Alexander wrote, so thank you. Some of the biggest Chinese companies that are investing in Ireland are also the same companies that are in the crosshairs in Washington right now. Huawei, TikTok, which everybody knows, and Wuxi Biologics, which is probably lesser known, but it makes the ingredients for drugs. And if you look at Chinese or Irish imports from China, ingredients for drugs, or APIs as they're called, are very, very important for Pfizer and everyone else who's exporting drugs and medicines from Ireland. The US is continuing to take actions against Huawei. Congress has ordered or passed legislation ordering the Chinese owner of TikTok to divest the app or have it banned. And Congress is also considering legislation to force US drug makers to sever ties with Wuxi, which would be a really big deal because Wuxi has gotten a big foothold in the US market and right now is actually critical, and US drug companies can't do without it at the moment. So another question for the Irish government is whether Washington will start to exert more pressure on Dublin in relation to these Chinese companies. Now, while Biden is president, I think Ireland will benefit from the fact that he thinks he's more Irish than the Ring of Kerry. A small example, when I covered politics in my previous role in 2020, on the campaign trail, you could easily get Biden's attention, even when he was ignoring his traveling press, by just saying, and hamming up the accent, "Mr. Biden, can an Irishman not get a question?" And he would turn around and his staff would say, "Sir, he is an Irishman, but he's not just an Irishman, he's a reporter." And Biden said, "No, he's just a nice Irish guy who wants to chat." It's corny, but it's true. In terms of Chinese pressure, I think Ireland may be more immune than some other countries because its tiny size means, let's face it, it doesn't really pose a threat to Beijing most of the time, even though it punches above its weight around the world. It benefits in the Chinese eyes from not being a member of NATO, as Alex said. But it's not completely immune because its membership of the EU means that with the growing concern about Chinese supply of dual-use technology to Russia is becoming a bigger deal. And the UK Defence Minister made a comment yesterday about some of this that we might talk about later because it was kind of instrumental of where things are going. And Ireland can find itself in the crosshairs if China retaliates against the EU when, for example, the EU is expected to put its own electric vehicle tariffs on Chinese EVs, which I suspect will be a little bit higher than they would have been now that the US has gone to 100% tariffs on these cars. What about geopolitics more generally? In my view, Ireland is handling its geopolitical relationship with China in a way that's not too dissimilar from how other small countries like New Zealand and Singapore are dealing with Beijing. So New Zealand is a US ally and a member of the Five Eyes intelligence sharing network, so very close to the US. But Wellington is usually very careful in public to avoid the kind of harsh rhetoric on China that comes out of Washington. It's fully aware of how China uses economic aggression against small countries like Lithuania or bigger countries like Australia, and is very conscious of the impact that potentially harsh rhetoric could have on its trade relationship. And as a small country like Ireland, where exports are crucial, New Zealand has a very fine line to walk. Singapore is a little different. It's a US partner, it's not actually an ally, but it helps the US in very important ways in terms of facilities for the US Navy, Air Force. It does many things behind the scenes that it doesn't advertise, and it's a critical piece of geography if there was a conflict over Taiwan. So it's very important, but Singaporean officials are also incredibly careful to balance their relationship with China, which is now their biggest partner, with its relations with Washington. So smaller countries are having to be very careful in how they do things. And I would say Ireland is taking a similar tack to New Zealand and Singapore, but maybe with occasional criticism of Beijing. So, in a speech about a year ago at the Royal Irish Academy, the Taoiseach, or Deputy Prime Minister Micheál Martin, he heralded the growing economic relations between China and Ireland. He stressed that Dublin should be clear-eyed about China's strategic objectives. Clear-eyed is a phrase that Jake Sullivan uses all the time, so I'm not sure whether he imported that. It's just a look of the Irish. He also talked about the concept of de-risking, which has been made popular by European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen. But then he stressed that did this not mean that Ireland, and I quote, was turning backs on economic, diplomatic, and cultural relations with China. He made other comments that would not have gone down well in China. He called out Beijing for refusing to criticize Russia over its invasion of Ukraine, said any effort to change the status quo in the Taiwan Strait by force would be unacceptable, and he urged China to improve its human rights record in Xinjiang. But when Micheál Martin visited Shanghai and Beijing in last November, he gave two speeches that, if you read them, were notable for taking a much softer line. And Irish diplomats will say that they prefer to raise concerns in private, and I think many countries follow that line too. But this does run counter to what the US wants, which is to have allies and partners actually criticize China in public to show China that they are all unified and pushing in the same direction. While more and more US allies and partners are willing to work together to do things that do anger China, smaller countries still face a big challenge in deciding how to engage Beijing. And I think right now, one of the most interesting cases, if not the most interesting, which is very far away, is the Philippines. Under the previous President Duterte, Manila had moved closer to Beijing, which really infuriated the US because they have a mutual defense treaty since 1951 with Manila, and it's one of their key allies in the world. But under the current President Marcos, Philippines has pivoted back to the US, including, as I said earlier, giving the US access to 4 bases in the Philippines, which will also be very, very important if there's a conflict over Taiwan. But as you've probably read, China is ramping up pressure on the Philippines, particularly around the Second Thomas Shoal, which is a submerged reef in the Philippines' exclusive economic zone. Chinese Coast Guard vessels have used water cannons and other very aggressive tactics to block the Philippines from sending supplies into 10 Marines troops who are stationed on a ship called the Sierra Madre, which, if you look at it, it's this rusting hulk that was deliberately grounded on the reef in 1999 to give the Philippines a stronger claim to that area. And if that ship is removed, it removes one of the triggers for the US-Philippines Mutual Defense Treaty. So it looks like a why does anyone care kind of thing, but it's massively, massively important. And China is trying to do everything to make it disintegrate or disappear as quickly as possible, and the Philippines are desperate to keep it in place. But for now, Manila is holding firm, partly because the US has repeatedly said that Sierra Madre is covered by the US-Philippines Defense Treaty, basically warning China, if you do anything that crosses a line, potentially you could be in a conflict with the US, but we're not going to tell you where that line is. And I think the world is watching very, very closely. I don't know how much attention it's getting in Ireland, but in Washington, we are writing more and more about that. Frankly, until this week, we are writing more about that than Taiwan. But pushing back against China poses another risk for Manila, one that I think applies to many nations right now that rely on the US to watch their backs. And yes, you knew this was coming, Donald Trump. I don't think you can overstress how much countries in the world right now are worried about Trump coming back because of his volatile approach to alliances, unless you are Vladimir Putin or a few other select characters. Would Manila be as confident pushing back against China if Trump was in the White House? I'm not so sure. He's the elephant in the room again for many nations, including Ireland. If Biden wins re-election, I think we'll see him continue along the same path on China, more or less. But if Trump wins, your guess about the China attack he will take, frankly, is as good as mine. And I've been covering Trump for something like, I don't know how many years now in China, and I have no idea what he'll do. He says he will impose 60% tariffs on all imports from China, which would be massive and would trigger a huge trade war. But the problem is, as always with Trump, we don't actually know if he means what he says, and he would do that. When he was in the White House, he had 3 phases on China. In the first year, he played nice with Xi Jinping in China, despite his campaign rhetoric about China economically raping the US. In his second year, he shifted and he launched a trade war, imposed tariffs on $300 billion worth of Chinese imports, by the way, which Joe Biden last week opted to keep in place, despite criticizing Trump at the time for doing what he had done. And then in his final year, as he was coming under a lot of pressure over his handling of the pandemic, or the China flu, as he would call it at one point, he opened the floodgates and he allowed his national security officials, who had been chomping at the bit for 3 years to take a whole range of serious actions. Trump had actually blocked them. He allowed them to do what they wanted to do. And so we saw a huge range of actions. We also saw him try and block TikTok, an effort that was initially failed in the courts, but now Trump is on the other side of that debate and saying we need to protect TikTok so that we can screw Facebook, essentially, to use Trump's language. So I think, the question is, will we get Monday Trump, Wednesday Trump, Friday Trump? Nobody knows. What we know is volatility and unpredictability. You don't need to be an expert to see that coming. US allies may be wary about working with Washington to counter China if they fear that Trump could unexpectedly do a deal that will leave them out on the limb exposed. And so I think what Biden's done in Asia is very, very meticulously done, very carefully planned, huge amount of coordination with allies. Not easy to do. You need to be on the same page to do that. And if we get the same kind of Trump as last time, even if he wanted to do that with allies, it's going to be much, much harder. And people are going to be much more nervous about taking risks. A few other concerns. Biden has pressed China on human rights, particularly over the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, or persecution of democracy activists in Hong Kong. But we reported in 2019 that at the G20 in Osaka, Trump actually told Xi Jinping he would tone down criticism of China's approach to Hong Kong if they could do something on trade. So he's very transactional. Anything could happen at any point in time. I think for allies right now, under the Biden administration, they're often briefed in terms of what the US is about to do. Sometimes it might be the day before, but at least they get a heads up. They feel like they know what's going on. If Trump wins, they'll be in the dark. They'll be mostly blind. And Trump's own officials last time, I was our bureau chief during the Trump years, and they hadn't a clue what was going on. We would have off-the-record meetings with cabinet secretaries. In a normal administration would be gold. And we couldn't write anything because we realized after a while they had no idea what Trump was going to do. One flavor of that, we interviewed Trump in 2017. And I asked him if he would consider making a grand bargain with North Korea, where North Korea would give up its nukes and the US would pull troops off the peninsula. I don't think he understood the question, but his reply was, if China doesn't solve the North Korea problem, I will. And the implication was that he would launch a preemptive military strike on North Korea, which is one thing that people were concerned about. The next week, I had a meeting with some of his top officials, and they said to me, what did the president tell you? I said, well, you saw the story. He said, well, what else did he tell you? And I said, well, anything he said that's off the record, I can't tell you. And anything else he said that's interesting is in the story. But why would you ask me? They said, because we have no idea what he's thinking. And these are, I won't say who they were, but these were very senior people. They were totally in the dark. So to end, and keep my promise to not look like Biden, to end on a cheeky note, if I was a senior Irish official wondering how to balance Ireland-China relations under a second Trump presidency, I would work extremely hard to try and engineer a summit between Trump and Xi Jinping, and I would make sure to hold it at Trump's golf course in Doonbeg, County Clare. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for some excellent introductory remarks, Demetri. You really set the stage very nicely for our conference. Yeah, this is a great time. Please feel free to grab a seat. Anybody else? There are a couple of seats in the front if you need a seat. Now, this is a great summary of kind of where we've been and where we're going. So let me start off with a couple of questions, then we can turn to our audience. Let me see. We've got over a good 35 minutes here, so we've got plenty of time. So I think that from your remarks and from what we've seen a gradual convergence over time. I remember when you and I first met, I was working for the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission, and we did a hearing in Brussels on China. And I have to say, they looked at us like we were nuts. In terms of the European perspective and the American perspective, we're so divergent at that point. The big question was this embargo on weapons at that time, which is now overtaken by time. But so we've seen a number of issues increase the convergence between the U.S. and Europe, generally speaking, on China. To list some of them, Huawei, espionage, the bullying of Lithuania, issues, as you mentioned, of human rights and the Uyghur issues, and of course the number one issue, perhaps, Chinese support for Russia and Ukraine, which you mentioned in terms of this UK minister's report. So where would you say the US and Europe are today? How, if this is a Venn diagram, how overlapping? On what issues is there synergy? What issues is there still a gap? And what's the trajectory?
I think, and thank you. I think, it depends where in Europe you're talking about. Obviously, different countries have different perspectives. I think overall, the US and the bigger European countries are rowing in the same direction in terms of they see the problem in China or the threat from China in similar ways. I would think the Europeans probably see it more through an economic lens. The Americans see it through an economic lens and definitely more of a military lens. I don't think anyone in Brussels or Dublin or London really thinks there's going to be a war with China, and that's very different from Washington. But I think there are differences in approaches, and while there has been a lot of convergence, and Europe, I would say, has moved much closer to the US in general, there's still areas where it's very difficult. So just one small example, the US has announced that it's going to have restrictions on outbound investment from the US into China. And right now the Treasury Department is basically creating the final rules and has been putting pressure on Europeans and also Japan and other Asian allies to do something similar. But all of the countries have different regimes. European capitals are a bit more wary about that than America. So there's still some areas where there's a big gap. And I think one of the big questions is, for example, I talked about the German ships going to the South China Sea. There's been a lot of stuff that looks good and sounds good, but the question is when it comes to, when the rubber hits the road, what will some of these countries do with the US? And are they having serious conversations right now about what role they would play if there was a conflict over Taiwan? Which is why I was actually quite surprised that Kurt Campbell said publicly that they had done war games with the UK. That's the kind of thing you normally keep very, very quiet. So overall, I think generally in the same direction, but it's not a straight road. And I think there are also things that could change in the next few months that would have a bearing. I think Ursula von der Leyen has been critical in pushing Europe in a more hawkish direction. Her top advisor is basically like a German version of Jake Sullivan. It's kind of eerie. It's almost like they're brothers. If she doesn't come back for a second term, who replaces her and what stance will they have on China? I think she's been really, really important. So I think there are kind of things like that that will be critical to watch in the next few months.
Now, that's excellent. And if we build on this, right, this issue of divergence between and among European countries, right? We see a very different approach towards China in a place like Serbia than a place like Czechia, in a place like Hungary versus a place like Germany, and in a place like France. So what are we to make as Americans sitting across the pond about all these divergent views that we hear from the European capitals? At the same time, Brussels seems to be, as you say, moving in a more Washington-type direction. So what should we make of this?
I think, Washington needs to remember that Europe is a federation of countries that have their own sovereign rights and interests, and particularly when it comes to economic issues, which is more important here. And if you're China, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to realize you need unanimity to do many things in the EU, which means you need Hungary on board. And you've got Viktor Orban, who's very close to Xi Jinping. Viktor Orban came to a Trump-sponsored event at the Heritage Foundation in Washington a few months ago, so he's tight with Trump. He met Trump at Mar-a-Lago, tight with Xi Jinping. And so China can quite easily rock the boat by just making sure that it keeps Hungary on side and invests in Hungary. And then Serbia, obviously, there's the obvious case of the US bombing the Chinese embassy in Serbia, which the Chinese still think was not an accident, and I don't think they will ever change their mind on that. So, Xi Jinping is clever in terms of what he's doing. They're not neophytes.
Yeah, driving the wedge, right? Nail house votes. So I have one more question, and then get your questions ready, because we're going to turn to the audience. And that's something that we've been looking at, and it's kind of evolving. And as you mentioned, these tariffs that are being put on Chinese electric vehicles and Chinese solar panels, et cetera. Right, so I was in China this summer with my two boys, and we went and saw some of these Chinese EVs, and they were blown away. They're like, Dad, before they were like, Dad, get a Tesla. Now they're like, do not buy a Tesla, right? This is awesome. awesome with the butterfly doors and everything. They were enamored with these Chinese EVs, but yet we're putting 100% tariffs on them, right? We have a Biden administration pushing us towards dealing with the climate issue, but at the same time making it harder for Americans to buy electric vehicles they can afford, right? So why shouldn't we, the Americans and the Europeans, let the Communist Party of China subsidize our electric vehicles? Isn't that better than having them use their money in other ways? Why not be more open to Chinese electric vehicles, especially when in their Made in China 2025 plan, 10 years ago, they telegraphed this and told us that we were going to do anyway. We didn't react, and now maybe we're a bit of sour grapes. Is that right? Or are we right to be reticent to allow these vehicles into our markets?
Depends if you're a politician or not. I think the short answer is jobs and politics. Yeah, for the American consumer or the European consumer, China is making great products now. It would make sense to bring them in, have more competition, drive prices down. I was reading this morning that BYD, which is the biggest Chinese EV producer, can produce a car now, sell it for roughly $10,000 in China. With tariffs, it would be $20,000 in the US, but that's still half the price of pretty much the cheapest electric vehicle you can buy in the US right now. But if you're an American politician, I'm going to just let all my jobs go to China. I mean, that's why Trump got elected, because that message, rightly or wrongly, got through to the population. So I think what Biden did with electric vehicles is a big dose politics, and also a big dose making sure that with 100% tariffs, very few Chinese cars, EVs, are going to get into the American market in the near future. So I think it's a combination of both. But I mean, particularly as 6 months out from the US election, we're going to see things like this. So Biden tripled tariffs on US imports of Chinese steel. The US imports very little Chinese steel, and the US shipbuilding industry, steel building industry, is not coming back. I mean, there's no way it's coming back. When Janet Yellen went to Beijing 3 weeks ago, she didn't even tell the Chinese they were going to triple tariffs on steel. And part of her shtick is that when we go to Beijing, we'll talk about areas where we cooperate, but to avoid miscommunication and miscalculation, we will explain to you all of the measures we're going to take so that even though you don't like them, you'll understand them. The reason she wasn't able to tell the Chinese about the steel tariffs was she didn't know. She didn't know. And so that's purely, if it was an economic decision, Janet Yellen would have known and would have been in the loop. Pure politics.
Quick follow-up on that then, right? So I've seen reports that when Xi Jinping goes to a particular city, he doesn't allow Tesla vehicles on the road, right? For national security issues. That's what the Chinese say. So if it's not economics, if Janet Yellen doesn't know about it, how seriously should we take the national security issues around EVs?
Well, I mean, there's limitations in where Teslas can drive in China, that's true. And separate from the tariffs, the US a few months ago launched an investigation into whether connected vehicles pose a national security threat to the US. I mean, I think there are legitimate questions. I mean, if the two countries were allies, you wouldn't be doing investigations like that, but they're increasingly adversaries. So we're going to see more and more of this. But I did a talk in Washington recently where I interviewed a guy called Tarun Chhabra, who probably is not really known in Dublin, but he is the architect of all the US technology policy that we've seen under Biden. Hugely influential guy, and I asked him, if you're going to investigate everything that has a chip in it, does that mean that a digital toothbrush, because in the future, they'll have some kind of chip in there, or they probably do already, does that mean that a toothbrush is a national security threat? Could it be sending information back to Beijing? Like, where do you draw that line? And no one has an answer to that, because it's a very hard question to answer.
I don't want the Chinese to know about my gingivitis. No, they know everything. Okay. Well, great. Thank you so much. So now the floor is open for any questions. Finbar, would you like to? I think we've got a microphone coming your way. And we're going to try to keep these to questions, not statements, and try to keep them brief and specific so Demetri has time to answer.
Yeah,
no.
Great speech. Thanks, Demetri. I had a question about Taiwan. Somebody who works in Brussels and is bemused by the lack of discussion about Taiwan. They can't get it on the agenda because various member states veto even the addition of the word to the official agendas. And there's no real joined-up planning going on for, say, the worst-case scenarios or even things like blockades. This morning I was on to the EU to try and get a comment on the blockade this morning, and it's like getting blood from a stone. I'd like you to talk a little bit, if possible, about the pressure the Europeans might face to join economic sanctions on China should the worst come to the worst from the United States. Because I think as much as people in Europe would like to avoid discussing these things, they probably can't avoid it forever, and it strikes me as a slight dereliction of duty that they're not even discussing it. So what sort of pressure would the Europeans, including Ireland, what would we face in a scenario like that?
I mean, there have been kind of quiet US efforts to try and get the Europeans and allies in Asia to start thinking more about this. So for example, a private consultancy called Rhodium Group, which does a lot of China economic analysis, was commissioned by the State Department to do a report on what a conflict over Taiwan would mean for the global economy. And I forget what their conclusion was in terms of the number, but it was some massive, massive, massive number in terms of annual economic damage. They sent that report to European capitals to kind of as some homework reading material. I think there have been some very, very nascent discussions about sanctions, but the problem is, I think if China invaded Taiwan, I think European countries would come on very quickly with sanctions, but at that point it's too late. Like, you want sanctions to prevent a conflict from happening. The difficulty is sanctions on China is so much more complicated than sanctions on Russia for a whole range of reasons. And also, if Beijing knows that Ireland is having conversations with Washington about preemptive sanctions, you're going to feel the hammer of economic coercion very quickly. So I think where it's happening very, very quietly. But overall, I would say officials in Washington and think tanks who've been writing about this recently are frustrated that there's not more talk about this. There's a very good report by someone called Emily Kilcrease at a think tank called CNAS, just on this very issue. It's probably the most comprehensive thing that's been done so far, if you're interested.
Great. Steve?
Fantastic.
Actually, maybe you could introduce yourself first. That'd probably be...
Steve Sun from Southwest in London. Fantastic talk. I think you raised a lot of important points about the difficulties of understanding China in terms of the Western leaderships, particularly the United States. What I want to push you is, do you get the sense that Washington and European capitals are capable of understanding what China really is about in terms of its ambitions and how it tries to achieve that? I mean, you mentioned yourself earlier about Xi Jinping wear his ambition on his sleeves when he talked about Make in China 2025. 10 years ago, we didn't see it, or we saw it, ignore it. So there is a question of, are they capable of understanding it? And then the second part of the question is, if they do understand it, are they capable of doing what it takes to counter the challenges that Xi Jinping is being put? Because again, you raise issues of domestic politics and inter-European politics, which shows the limitations of how we are able to respond as and when required.
So I think, in terms of kind of China knowledge in Europe, I might leave that to some of the experts who are working more on that in the room. But I mean, Washington has, on the positive side, it has more China experts per capita probably than anywhere in the world. The array of knowledge inside and outside the US government on China is phenomenal. There's an equally large number of bullshitters who know nothing about China, who, now that China is a popular thing to talk about, want to be quoted on the record all the time.
We didn't invite them to the conference.
No, none of them are here. But there are lots of politicians who, when I was covering politics, had no time for the Financial Times because we're relevant in Casper, Wyoming. But as soon as I changed to this US-China job, they were like, Demetri, can you quote me on my views on China? So the difficulty, I think, is that the US, as much expertise as there is, China is a harder target. The decline in academic exchanges, official government exchanges, and the COVID pandemic, Xi Jinping is tightening up of the ability to get information on China. There's a whole array of reasons why it's more difficult. I also think, and I apologize to my American friends in the room, I think one of the Achilles heels of US policy on most countries is I think the US government is pretty bad at putting itself in the shoes of other countries, not to be sympathetic to what China wants, but if you want to have effective policy, you have to understand what China wants, whether you like it or not. Sometimes I think that's a little bit lacking. And then there's the politics. I mean, you know, there's no issue in Washington that unites Democrats and Republicans more than the fact that they see China as a threat. But that doesn't mean they're united in terms of how you respond to China. You know, you'll hear a lot of criticism of, okay, Biden has rebooted relations with China, Tony Blinken's gone twice, Janet Yellen's gone twice, Gina Raimondo's gone once, Jake Sullivan is having these secret meetings with Wang Yi. This is just talking for the point of talking, and this is why China always wins. And then people on the other side will say, hold on a second, what you don't realize is what the US has been trying to do, I think, over the last year, more importantly, it's not about getting big deliverables on different policy areas. It's been about avoiding a conflict over Taiwan. I think that's been the number one driving factor. It's not said publicly as much, but I think that's what's going on. And so you either buy into that engagement will help prevent conflict, or you don't buy into that. And depending where you come from politically, you'll have a view on that. I think the politics makes it harder. I mean, the Chinese system, when it decides to do something, as you know better than I do, they have fewer obstacles, don't have to deal with popular opinion as much as in the US, can just go for it. In Washington, you know, it's impossible. I mean, it's slow, it's clunky, and usually they get to the right place at the end, but it's very bumpy along the way.
There's also been a fair share of deterrence, right? Joe Biden has said on 4 separate occasions that the US would defend Taiwan, and they try to walk it back afterwards.
Well, so he said it 4 times. The first time the White House preempted, I think the first time was in Tokyo, anyway. First time he said it, the White House preemptively emailed the media to say, policy hasn't changed, policy hasn't changed. The second and third time, if you email them and ask them, they'd say, policy hasn't changed. The fourth time, they just didn't bother responding. But then in San Francisco, after he met Xi Jinping at the press conference, I got the first question, and that's exactly what I asked him. Do you still stand by your commitment? And
yes.
He totally deflected it. I mean, it was just before the Taiwanese election, so I can understand. But you know, there's kind of ambiguity in the US strategic ambiguity. So.
Ambiguity remains ambiguous.
Sure.
All right. We'll take Yvonne.
Thank you, Yvonne Mariotti, News. Thanks so much, Demetri. Really illuminating. Yeah, from Howth, exactly, fellow Howthenian. So my question is about how the US administration, how US officials in DC see the expansion of China's soft power around the globe, particularly in the developing world, and whether, you know, how this current conflict in Gaza plays into that. You know, China, clearly, I see it, my job at the UN now is exploiting the fact that the US has been diminished in terms of its moral authority over this. Does the US see that? Are they concerned that China will move into that space in terms of its ability to reach the developing world with soft power?
I think they do. I mean, but whether they can actually, like, recognizing it and doing something about it are different. Like, I'll give you a couple of small examples. So I guess it was maybe 2 years ago now, maybe it was last year, when China signed a security agreement with the Solomon Islands. Pretty much in the Washington media, Washington-based media, there was very little coverage. I was actually out in Australia with the head of Indo-Pacific Command at the time, and it was a huge story in the region. And I came back to Washington, it was like nothing had happened. But it did trigger inside the administration a recognition that for a couple of decades, the US had basically removed itself from Pacific Island nations, had closed embassies and consulates, really wasn't a presence. And the next thing you knew, Kurt Campbell and some of his officials were off to the Solomon Islands with their surfboards, and you know, everyone was visiting Pacific Island nations to kind of show the love, and we'll send a Coast Guard cutter here, and we'll help you tackle illegal fishing there. But the problem is, for the rest of the world, it looks like the US, it's too little, too late, and it's always reactionary. More recently, there's a kind of a set of agreements called COFA, which is to provide the Marshall Islands and other parts of the Pacific Island nations with economic support in return for allowing the US access to certain facilities. And it's geographically very, very important. Considered to be small but a big deal, and not doing it would send a real strong message to China that the US is not really committed to matching its rhetoric with reality. Congress dithered on that for months and almost didn't pass. The amount of money was something like $600 million, I think. It could be less. So it wasn't huge compared to the US budget. But even there, a small thing that was very important, that the whole US government was telling Congress, this is super important. It took them 6 months to do it. And so I think the problem is that they recognize it sometimes, but I don't think, again, they're not great at putting themselves in others' shoes. And because if you've been the biggest power in the world for a long time, it's harder to understand how smaller powers feel about stuff like that. And so I think they kind of get it, but they don't really get it, is my sense. I mean, obviously it depends on the official. But.
Look, I just want to do a plug for our final panel, which is going to be about smaller powers and their relations with China in comparison to Ireland. I'd also like to give a plug to the China Global South Initiative, which us at Notre Dame have with the Atlantic Council, and we held a conference in February, a 2-day conference, and some of the speakers here in this room, and we had an amazing turnout. I mean, we had thousands of people online and in person, and we had administration, for U.S. administration officials. In fact, Kurt Campbell was slated to speak at that and later had to have his deputy come. But I can say that in Washington, there is a growing appreciation for China in the Global South as an important issue set. And so, yeah, no, I'm glad you raised the issue. Okay, Dave Schulman, for another plug on the China Global South Initiative. Yeah.
Great. Thanks, Josh. Thanks, Demetri. So Dave Schulman from the Atlantic Council. Related to the last question somewhat, in the sense that a lot of focus has been given to China's efforts to shape the information space in developing countries and in some cases interfere in their political processes. There's been a lot more attention, for obvious reasons, in the United States to the potential for China interfering in the political process in the United States. President Biden has mentioned this now a couple times in some of his meetings with Xi Jinping, and I know this has happened at lower levels as well. No one expects anything on the scale of Russian interference in the 2016 election, but this is something that is rising in salience as people watch what China's doing and how it is mapping more onto what Russia has done in terms of interference in the U.S. and elsewhere. And then I know there's also rising concern here in Europe, and there's been some statements by the UK most notably, but by others as well, about China's interference in political processes in Europe, as well as use of coercion to try to achieve China's aim. So I guess my question would be, to what extent do you think that issue of interference in political process in the United States, but also in Europe, will continue to rise in salience and maybe be another issue that brings the transatlantic, kind of alliance, or at least transatlantic unity, closer together as we grow more collectively concerned about China's activities to mess with our democracies?
I think it will grow. I mean, recently the FBI did a briefing for journalists based on this topic about the election. But the difficulty is it's hard to talk about publicly because the US often doesn't want you to know where they're getting their information, or China might be doing things that they want to track for a while before they make it public. So I don't think it really ever quite percolates into the national consciousness the way some other things do. And then sometimes I think there's a little bit of kind of a parody aspect of things. So China during the trade war with under Trump, I think they took out a 2-page ad in one of the newspapers in Iowa. It might have been before the caucuses, I can't remember. And it caused a huge storm. And I kind of looked at that and said, it's a public ad in a newspaper in the Chinese government's name. People can read that and understand what it is. So there are things like that I think people get worked up about that are a little bit over the top. But I do think it's a concern. And one of the questions that people are grappling with about TikTok is, can China control the algorithm and have young Americans see things that might be pro-Biden or pro-Trump or whatever? So I think it's an issue, but it's right now I don't think it's right front and center. But as we get closer to the election, and particularly, if Trump and Biden start to make, or more Trump probably, make China a big issue, then I think we'll hear more and more about it.
Oh, I see in the blue here. Yeah.
Thank you very much for this highly interesting conversation. Velina Chekarova is my name. I'm geopolitical consultant. I would like to hear your personal best case and worst case scenario for the US-China relations in, let's say, the next around 10 years. Where do you see the relationship in, let's say, 5 to 10 years from your personal perspective, based on your experience in your best case and worst case?
You brought your oracle bones?
I mean, best case is, and I'm not ascribing a probability to this, but best case is that Xi Jinping, for some reason, disappears from the Chinese political scene, and someone who's a little bit more or a little bit less authoritarian replaces him, and China maybe starts to think we need to go back to one of the earlier paths we were on. Right now, I don't see that happening. I think the only caveat I would make towards myself is I think Xi Jinping right now is under massive pressure. He's the first Chinese leader since Deng who's now dealing with huge economic problems and could be an economic downturn of sorts. No one has had to deal with that. And the China dream is built on, it's not that difficult from or different from the American dream. It's like, I grew up on a farm somewhere in rural China. My kids went to Shenzhen and worked in a factory. Their kids will work in a slightly better factory, and they might get into the services industry. And right now, youth unemployment is over 20%, I think. So I think she's under huge pressure. So the question is, within the system, there are definitely voices of opposition. Do they have any power to get him to change course? And if he did leave the scene, would you find a new generation who would say, yeah, Xi Jinping used to be 100% good, 0% bad, but now he's 80% good, 20% bad? I don't know, but I think that's best case. Worst case, which I think is more likely, is that things just keep getting worse and worse between the US and China. I don't see any, there's a few areas where there might be cooperation. Yes, maybe on climate change, maybe in a few other places. But overall, the fundamental differences between the two countries remain, and they're getting worse. Taiwan is going to become more and more challenging over time. I mean, it'll be up and down, but the trend is towards danger. On technology, China is becoming more and more powerful. The US is going to try and stop it from developing certain kind of AI-based weapons and other things, but China is powering ahead. We had a story in 2021 that China had sent a hypersonic weapon around the world. And when I wrote that story, I had a number of Americans email me privately saying, Demetri, you're an idiot. You don't understand nuclear weapons. You don't understand hypersonics. You don't understand this, and this, and this, and this, because it's impossible. And then 2 weeks later, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs came out and said, yes, it's true. It was a near Sputnik moment. So China is going to get to where China is going to get. The US may be able to slow it down a little bit, but I suspect it's not going to be as successful slowing China as some people would like. So those tensions are going to get more difficult. And I can't, again, I am an optimist, but I can't really see any area where I think things are going to get better while Xi Jinping's in power.
There are only 700 American students studying in China right now. Only 700. 300,000 Chinese in America, 700. And I think that's something that I, as a professor, and other professors in America grapple with is, I just don't have a lot of students who want to go to China and learn about China. And if they do, they're cold warriors, right? They're not, the economic benefits are not what they used to be.
I remember before she died, I saw Madeleine Albright and just to chat about things, and she said, she told me a story that a senior Chinese official, so after she had left government, a senior Chinese official had come to see her for a private meeting, and she started kind of telling him about how Washington worked, and he stopped her and he said, Madam Secretary, have you ever written a book in Chinese or a novel about China? And she said, no. He said, I've read all these books in English. I don't need to learn more about your system. I think you need to learn a little bit more about my system. Now, it was hyperbole, but it was also a point. I mean, the US right now is facing a big problem. The number of China experts right now is large. But the number of people who have lived in China and speak Chinese and just understand China on the ground is going to be fewer and fewer unless that trend is reversed. And if you have worked in mainland China and you come back to want to work in Washington, it's harder or takes longer to get a security clearance if you want to work in the government if you've spent significant time in mainland China. So it's a kind of a catch-22 situation.
Yeah, for sure.
Thanks. I wanted to ask, sorry, I'm Isabella Jackson from Trinity College. Just stand up so I can see you. I wanted to ask about the Belt and Road Initiative. I think if we'd had this event a few years ago, that would have been mentioned by now. And Ireland was one of the many places that China used that kind of umbrella to invest in and build its influence in. I just wondered, are we not talking about it because we can forget about it now, or is it still significant and something that should be playing into our discussions?
Maybe we can take another one because we can take one more question. You take them both together? How does that sound? So, yeah, this gentleman over here. And then we'll get two to finish up.
Thanks. Andrew Cossey from University College Cork. Just to push you again a bit more on the future, just to get your assessment of the risks of a really bad scenario. You know, how high would be the risk of a war between the US and China, and you know what are the factors that might play into that? Taiwan, but maybe also South China Sea, Philippines, and so on. Thank you.
So the danger of taking two questions is you very easily forget the first one.
BRI.
So two reasons. One, if I'm totally candid, I personally report less on BRI because I'm in Washington, so I tend to, it's not kind of my area of expertise, so it's a little bit that. But it's also, I feel, it's getting less media attention in the last couple of years because as China's had economic problems, you've had lots of stories about the debt diplomacy and the debt traps in different places like Sri Lanka and elsewhere. And then China, I think, having to pull back a little bit because of its kind of financial constraints at the moment. It's not in the news as much as it was, and it feels like China has pulled back a little bit, but that's kind of my superficial view of things. But I mean, it probably should be getting more attention in the media than it is. But the problem these days is there's so much China news. I mean, I get pitched X number of reports every day, and I have to tell people, A, reports aren't news, so we generally don't do them. But like I have 20 reports coming in from different think tanks, all excellent. But it's really hard on the China beat now for people just to kind of cover the whole waterfront, which is a problem. And but probably not a satisfactory answer, but.
All I can say on the BRI, because we have done work on this, is that it's not an impression. The numbers are falling. I think the last numbers we have for China's debt to Africa in 2000, I think either 22 or 23, was $1 billion. It went from like 20 billion, it just crashed, right?
Wow,
so it's not just your impression. We've seen a...
So I'm not going to be fired.
They call it like a thin and beautiful Belt and Road or something, right?
Okay. So on conflict, the question is like, how bad could it get? I mean, it's World War III. I mean, if the US and China get into a conflict, it's going to be catastrophic. I mean, it's economically, just if Taiwan, if the chip fabrication plants, TSMC and these other big companies that no one had really paid attention to a few years ago, if they go offline, I don't mean destroyed, but they just go offline because if you've got a war, they won't be able to get the inputs they need to make the chips. I mean, we're not going to have iPhones or Google phones or anything else. Refrigerators, everything relies on Taiwan. So it's going to be massive. And that's just economically, and then obviously loss of life. And the other thing that has not been discussed publicly much in the last few years, and US officials don't really talk about it, although think tanks and universities are starting to do war games about this. We were chatting about this last night. Is, a few years ago, the US believed that China had 200 nuclear warheads, which is still a lot, but 200 compared to 1,550 that the US has deployed under arms control treaties. China now has 500. A year ago it had 500, and the US estimates that it'll have 1,500 by the middle of the next decade. So any conflict over Taiwan, the issue of nuclear arms is going to be like a Damocles sword. It's going to be there. And the US knows very, very little about Chinese current thinking on nuclear policy. So I think I don't like thinking about it because that's how bad it's going to be.
Quick follow-up, what about Japan in a Taiwan scenario?
Well, Japan is going to be dragged in because, I mean, it used to be, as an Irishman working for the FT, when a British official came to Washington and pleaded with the Americans to call it a special relationship, I would always strip that out of my copy. Because the special relationship was Ireland. No, but more seriously, I mean, when you talk to US officials right now, the most important US alliance in the world is not the UK, it's Japan, and probably Australia number 2. The US has huge military assets in Japan, it has its bases. If the US gets dragged into a war with China or in any way, shape or form, Japan is going to be involved whether it likes it or not. So.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Come together.
Thank you.